because this one we we did one. Tell me the name of it again. I always Tim, what's the last one that we did? That the Bold City Opera. The name of it. One more time.
We did Swear Angelic. I think
That's
that was the last one of these I did in a
right, it was.
program for.
Okay.
They've done some operas since then, but that was the one we did a program for this
That's
group.
yes. And
Yeah.
that one was just wonderful. Oh, it was magical. So we're really looking forward to this one because this is going to be in Taliaferro Hall. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
It's not going to be in the cathedral.
Right.
So we've invited Tim here to help us know before we go, to understand what we're going to see, and also just talk generally. We're going to talk generally firsthand about opera. Just I've got some questions about him. We're going to give some general. I think everybody needs when you're talking about specific music, whether any type of music, I think it really helps to have something in your suitcase that you can pull out, vocabulary, an idea of what you're going to be seeing or looking or how things are put together. It just makes the whole experience so much richer. So I'm going to kick it off, Tim, and let's talk about the beginnings of opera and where opera started.
Okay, sure. Well, opera is a hundreds of years old art form. It's over 500 years old, and it's extremely broad. It's a huge genre. It's almost like saying classical music. It's just an infinitely broad, huge art form. Like I say, it's been around for 500 years, and it's developed in all sorts of different directions. Different countries have their own styles and all this kind of thing. It actually goes back. The origins, however, though, can be pinned down quite precisely to around about the year 1597, 1598. And this was during the time of the Florentine Renaissance, the peak of the Florentine Renaissance. And if you know anything about the Florentine Renaissance, one of the big driving forces of that intellectual movement was an attempt to recreate the art of the ancient Greeks. They highly respected the cultures of antiquity, hugely, Rome and Greece, and they really were very influenced by the philosophers of ancient Greece, the thoughts of ancient Greece, and they just kind of looked to the ancients as sort of an ideal, sort of lost civilization that they felt they could really learn a lot from. So a lot of the arts of the Renaissance, sculpture, and so on, poetry, all sorts of the arts of the Renaissance and the intellectual currents of the Renaissance were driven by reverence for the ancient Greeks. And opera specifically was an attempt to recreate the tragedy of ancient Greece, the tragic plays of ancient Greece, because there was a theory, and they were probably correct on this, although to this day we don't know for sure, that ancient Greek drama was accompanied by music. We don't know anything about what it would have sounded like or anything along those lines, but there's good evidence that ancient Greek plays would have been accompanied by music. And so the origin of opera was an attempt by the Europeans during the Florentine Renaissance to recreate ancient Greek drama, complete with music. And
Tim,
that's it in a nutshell.
Tim,
And so, yeah.
was that the time, and just going back, just with the art background, was was that the time when there was also a Greek revival in art as well, or did that? Are
It
you?
probably was. I'm not really an expert on that side of things, but it most likely was.
Yeah, it would make
And they,
sense.
yeah. And
It
they, go ahead.
no, I said it would make sense with just all the statues. You know how
Oh,
they.
yeah. So I'm sure that I'm not an overall expert on the Renaissance, but I do know this nugget that it was an attempt. So there was a group of intellectuals. They actually called themselves the Florentine Camerata. And basically, as I understand it, put in modern layman's terms, it was a bunch of snobby artists and intellectuals who got together over over drinks and discussed what they thought, all their ideas about ancient Greek culture and literature and poetry and drama and music and everything. And out of that little intellectual clique came the first opera. And the first opera, I believe, was entitled Daphne, Dafne. Now, you'll notice right away that the earliest operas are almost exclusively based on ancient Greek stories, tragedies, myths, heroes, legends, etc., etc. So you're going to find all these early operas were ancient Greek stories of some form or another, usually involving the gods and all the pantheon of Greek, mythological characters and gods and demigods and heroes and all that kind of thing, for obvious reasons. They were trying to go back to ancient Greece, and they weren't just trying to do some modern riff on it. They were really trying to go back with exactly what they thought it would be. And so, but nobody really knew, of course. And also to this day, we don't know what it really have sounded like in ancient Greece. There's no way we can ever recreate that. But it was their attempt. They took a stab at it. And so there was all kinds of discussions about how it would have been done, and this and that and the other thing. Would it have been accompanied? Would it have been a cappella? With their chorus? All this kind of stuff. And so that's the firmament out of which opera was born. And so being that it was in Florence, where this first, I think the first surviving opera is, I think the first surviving opera that we have any real record of is roundabout from the year 1600, I believe. And I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's, again, it's based on ancient Greek myth. So now you can see right out of the box why opera in Italy have almost been synonymous throughout the centuries, because that's where it was born. It was born in Florence. And all the early operas would have been Italian and in Italian. And to this day, obviously, Italy certainly likes to think of themselves as the king of the opera world. And it's hard to argue with that. All throughout the centuries, opera has been loved by the Italians, and not just the upper classes. Now, this naturally would have been, no surprise, a very aristocratic form of entertainment early on, nobility and so on, because it was expensive and you had to have instrumentalists, you had musicians. Opera has always been an expensive art form, kind of a lavish art form, because it requires a lot by its very nature. You've got to have, actors and singers, composers, costumes, sets, all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't, generally speaking, lend itself to easy production if you haven't got a lot of money and a lot of resources. So that's where it was born. However, when opera started to flourish in the 17th and 18th century in Europe and in Italy, it was loved by everybody. It was surprisingly egalitarian. And there's stories of the early opera houses being packed to the rafters, and they'd have places where the poorer classes could go for a cheaper price, naturally the bad seats and all. But it was loved by an entire people. It really was. And that's kind of stayed true over the centuries. Not those early composers right up through the centuries, Bellini, Rossini, on into the Puccini and everything right up to this day. And of course, obviously, over the centuries, it spread all over Europe. Germany developed its own style of opera, very important. France developed its own style of opera. England did. They all kind of did. And all these different European countries eventually sort of formed their own schools of opera. They had their own sort of traits and their own tendencies and their own sort of characteristics. They became quite distinct. Yeah. And it was a source of quite fierce national pride, too, for a lot of these countries. I'd say probably the three real biggies would have to be, of course, Italy, Germany, and France. Those would probably be your big three. Although England gave its share, too, to the opera world. But Italy, France, and Germany would probably be your real big sort of schools of opera throughout the years. So yeah, that's just in a very neat nutshell how it began.
Yeah, Opera 101 real quick, fast.
Yeah,
There's a couple of things for the layperson. Let's talk about a vocabulary that
yeah,
we might need. I know one of the ones that we hear floated around is libretto.
yeah, yeah,
Okay. Can you hit on maybe two or three or four more words that we need to
yeah.
have in our vocabulary suitcase?
Well, a libretto is basically the text of the opera. It's poetry that is. It's usually poetry that is sung. That's actually sung. So it's basically the text, the words of the opera, is the libretto. So what they'll do is they'll often. It's kind of like it's sort of parallel to if you take a book and adapt it to a movie version. There has to be a screenplay, and so you can't necessarily just take an actual novel and just word for word translate it into a movie. That has to be done, and that's an art, and there's a process to it. And it's exactly the same with opera. You might get a story or a play, but someone needs to sort of adapt it to a workable form for the actual singing in the opera. Yeah, and
All right.
and so a libretto, it's basically it's the text of the opera, the story of the opera, the poetry of the opera. Then there's other terms. You might hear the term overture. And overture is traditionally, and again, some operas have these, some don't. This is all very generic and general, broad strokes here. But an overture is, generally speaking, the orchestral introduction before the actual singing starts. And so throughout the common practice period of the mainstream operas we'd be talking about, you usually have a 10 or 5, 10, maybe 15-minute long orchestral introduction. And oftentimes this orchestral introduction would introduce you to some of the main themes or tunes that you were going to hear sung throughout the course of the opera. And sometimes they'd even kind of, sort of in miniature, sort of spell out in musical form the story of the opera in broad terms. So that's the beginning. That's one term. An aria. An aria is usually contrasted with what we call recitative. An aria is usually, you can think about it as in musical theater, we'd call it a number. It's usually a piece, a particular song that you could extract and sing independent, that is sung usually by one person expressing a certain thought. Nessun Dorma is a great example from Puccini. It's usually one, you might hear these pieces taken out and sung at recitals and things like that. They're kind of standalone, individual, one-off songs that a singer would sing. Recitative, now this is interesting. This comes all the way back to the beginnings of opera, when they were kind of batting around how to get all of the words that were necessary to convey the story of the opera, but they couldn't sing all these words. It was too much. It would just take too long to sing in all the words that were required to convey the text. So they had to figure out, how the heck are we going to do this? What would the ancient Greeks have done? And they didn't want to just speak the words, but it was too much to really sing. So they developed a technique called recitative, which is kind of halfway between spoken dialogue and sung dialogue. So usually what will happen is there'll be some chords played in the orchestra or the accompaniment, and you'll hear the singers kind of quickly, kind of singing through these words, but in a very quick, sort of simplified way. And it was a way to sort of get text pushed out, but in a way that made it reasonable, so they could get all that text out to the audience without having to sing every bit of it. So it was basically a sort of a halfway point between speaking the text and singing the text. And your traditional operas like your Marriage of Figaro and things like that, often you'll hear lots of recitative. It'll be very obvious. That goes away, though. Generally speaking, that tends to go away later on in later centuries, like with Wagner and Verdi and things like that. It's more through composed. And as opera developed, you find that over the centuries, the little individual components like the recitative and the aria and all that stuff, and even the overture, become less and less distinct. It's very easy. If you ever gone to like an oratorio, for example, like a Handel oratorio, like Messiah, right? Basically, those are traditional operas that just aren't staged. And you'll hear recitatives and arias in Messiah very, very, very clearly. And in operas of that period, you could easily go through and say, okay, that's number one, that's number two, that's number three, that's number four, just like you can in Messiah. There's a chorus, here's an aria, here's, you know. But over the centuries, those distinctions started to disappear. And finally, when you get to someone like Wagner in his prime, they disappear entirely. So you're just going to be listening to 4 hours of continuous music with almost no distinct breaks whatsoever throughout it.
And that is so true.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, one other thing that and while we're kind of on that subject, that the opera is staged like a play.
right.
Okay.
Yep,
So, I mean, I mean, we like Madame Butterfly, Carmen,
yep,
but they do use contemporary staging as well, which
that's
is,
true.
I think, which is what we're going to be aware of,
Yep,
at our, but it's still the same in the same umbrella.
yep, yep.
Is that
Oh yeah,
correct?
yeah,
Oh,
absolutely. I'm a bit of a purist, like, and this is just me editorializing here, but you're very correct. Most of the time, if you go to a modern opera, and you like you might go to something like I don't know, like Wagner's Parsifal or something that's traditionally staged in the Middle Ages, and you've got medieval knights and all that kind of thing. And it's a trend nowadays to like reimagine the staging and like put it into a modern doctor's office or something like that. They're oh yeah, they do that all the time. Like, for centuries, these operas have been done in the traditional way, and they want to get creative. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, yeah. Or you'll see Carmen modernized and put into a modern office setting, or something like that. They do that They do that frequently, especially places like the Met, these big places. Yeah, but yeah, they definitely do that. Um, this weekend, the operas, it is a contemporary setting, but only because the operas are set in a contemporary, well, not really a contemporary time, but say the 1960s. And so you'll see a 1960s set. Yeah.
that. Okay, well, now before we get into talking about the operas that we're going to see and on this weekend, let's talk a little bit about the Bowl City Opera.
Yeah.
And because I think this is a great organization for Jacksonville.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah. It's a
so
real treasure.
yeah, give us an overview, maybe how it started,
Yeah. Yeah.
mission, and
Well, I got their information, right here. I'm actually on their board. I'm one of the founding board members of the opera. I'm the secretary on the board. I've been on there since they started. And so they often tap me to be their accompanist because I do it for free, as just as a member of their board. And they started in late 2022. They were founded by the local soprano Christine Alfano. Now, y'all probably wouldn't be able to remember, but when she was just out of college back in 2019 until about the time COVID hit, it might have been 2018, right around 2018, 2019, she was singing in the Cathedral Choir for a couple of years. So she was in the Cathedral Choir singing soprano for a couple of years, right out of college. And after COVID hit, that blew all that up. And she went on to get her master's degree in Kentucky. And then she came back to town. And at first she was going to rejoin the Cathedral Choir, but unfortunately, these other projects made it so she couldn't realistically do that. She had too much on her plate, unfortunately. She's fantastic. So she founded this along with the local conductor, Brandon Smith. Now, Brandon Smith is the organist currently at San Jose Episcopal Church. And he's actually subbed for me a couple times here at St. John's when I've been away. Very good organist, very good conductor. And he's been in town for a while, and he actually went off to Ithaca College a few years ago to get his master's degree in conducting, I believe it was. And he didn't realize that was the same school I went to as an undergrad back in the 90s. So we have that common alma mater basically under our belt, me and him. Also, no, just for the record, Tony Steve went to that same school. And also Michael Mastronicola, who's now at All Saints Episcopal on Hendricks. all four of us went to Ithaca College in upstate New York, which is freakishly weird. A little tiny liberal arts college in upstate New York. Um, Four of us are in Jacksonville now doing music. It's amazing. I don't know how that worked out. Anyway, those two basically, so Christina Alfano and Brandon Smith formed this. And they wanted it to be not just another opera company, but they wanted it to prioritize local talent, local musicians, local singers, and they wanted to create operas that were accessible and immersive. So one of the things you'll notice that they've done, well, with Suor Angelica, by putting the story of a group of nuns in a church and being accompanied by the organ, again, very immersive. They did Bartók's Bluebeard's Castle last fall. They chose Riverside Baptist, or what used to be Riverside Baptist Church. And that kind of looks like an old castle, and it's kind of got dungeony qualities to it. If you've ever been in there, it very much evokes that atmosphere. And so they're a scrappy company. They don't have a lot of money, obviously. And so they try to get really creative about not only what pieces they do, but how they perform them, how they're accompanied, because they can't afford full orchestras, certainly at this point, and where they're set. So they try to be very, and also they're trying also to be very socially aware and culturally relevant. And you'll definitely see that very, very, very viscerally in these two performances this weekend, talking about the Holocaust. And we just passed Holocaust Remembrance Day a few days ago.
I sure did.
So that's kind of their goal. They want to make opera accessible to audiences that might not otherwise be into it, and really hammer home the point that operas are not just 4 hours of watching fat people sing in some language you don't understand, which is unfortunately a very, very widespread misconception, And so that's what they're trying to do.
Well, good. All right. So now let's start and get down to what everybody was here for, and they got more than they bargained for. Ha ha ha. But anyway, let's talk about what's going to happen with another sunrise and for a look or a touch. And you've already kind of touched on it, that these are both operas that deal with the Holocaust. And I wanted to share something that I found and I hope, Tim, that you can say her name. It's Polish, I think, isn't it? The
Christina Zawalska.
Yeah, it's hard. And I'm going to let Tim tell you about the essence of how these two particular operas came to be written. But I want to share this with you just to kind of give you, because I loved it. And this was written, I believe this is one of her poems that was written in Auschwitz. He who is able can easily read the writing that appears among the rye. Yet they go peacefully in a long line along the edge of the forest, following stream's course. And they look around in silent rapture, wondering how to begin lives here, wondering, after years of pain and suffering, how exactly here might come rebirth. Suddenly, through the thicket, they glimpse the flame, tightened heart, despair, flashes of memories, and a strange odor. Fear froze them in place. They shuddered, terrified, and turned to stone. And I wanted to use this to begin because it sets the tone and really the pace, I think, for these two operas. And so now, Tim, what I'd like for you to do, if you would, is just tell us the story behind these two operas.
Yeah. So both these two operas sort of have a common genesis. They both the first For a Look or a Touch comes from 2007, and Another Sunrise comes from 2012. So they are both less than 20 years old. And the composer, Jake Heggie, is only 6 years older than I am. He was born in 1969. So he's very much a contemporary composer. Now, both of these operas were commissioned by a group called Music of Remembrance. And they are a Seattle-based performing arts organization. They're focused on human rights and social justice. They were founded in 1998, and they evolved from an initial focus on Holocaust remembrance to honoring the resilience of all people excluded or persecuted for their faith, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. They're admired around the world. I'm reading from their piece here, but they're admired around the world for their leadership in commissioning and premiering new works by leading composers, chamber ensembles, song cycles, choral works, dance films, or dance music, films, music dramas, all kinds of things. But their center focus is on music and arts related to the Holocaust, so that voices from the Holocaust are heard nowadays. And I'll start, even though it's chronologically the second composed of these two, it's the first one that we're going to perform on the bill this weekend. So I'll start with Another Sunrise. Now, this one, personally, of the two operas, now this one's about 25 minutes long in performance. The Look or a Touch is a little longer. That's a more like 35, 40 minutes in performance. So this is the shorter of the two. And it only has one singing part. It's a one-person opera, one part, and that's it. And of course, the accompaniment, which consists of piano and strings and clarinets and flute, I believe. Yes. So it's strings, woodwind, and piano for accompaniment. So it's a chamber group. This opera tells the story of Christina Zawalska, also known as Christia. Now, she was born Sonia Landau, a Jewish woman who escaped the Warsaw Ghetto. She changed her name, joined the Polish resistance, and was ultimately captured and sent to Auschwitz. Now, the whole point of this opera is that she's actually truly a Jew, but they don't know it. They think she's just a Polish resistance fighter. So she gets sent to the camp too, because you can't be a resistance fighter. But at least she's not at the bottom of the totem pole in the pecking order, because they see her as a turncoat Polish resistance fighter, not an actual Jew. And if she was a Jew, obviously she'd be on the very bottom. So that's kind of what saves her. She was in 1945, she was able to escape the camp and survive, going on to write about her experience. She has memoirs and everything. And while in prison, she hid her Jewish identity and was instead, as I mentioned, classified as a political prisoner. She became known as the camp poet, sharing her poetry throughout the camp to boost morale and inspire prisoners to persevere until liberation came. Starving and on the brink of death, a well-positioned older prisoner who was inspired by her poetry petitioned to have her sent to Birkenau and given one of the few positions in the Effektenkammer, which are the storage facilities for personal effects confiscated from arriving prisoners. So you see throughout this opera, she gets shipped to this camp with some Jews, and these are her friends. They become her friends. And she is saved by the fact that they don't know she's a Jew, while at the same time seeing her Jewish friends who admitted they were Jews die right before her face. So an enormous amount of survivor guilt going on here. And there's a very important scene in the opera where she is commanded by her superiors to start beating the newly arrived Jewish women to put them in line. And they're basically like, it's either them or you. Are you going to beat them and do what you're told, or we're going to send you out in the field to die? And in the opera, it's very powerful. She says without even thinking or trying, she feels her fist forming and she feels her hand rising, and she does what she's told and sells her soul, basically. But she lives. What would you do? What would I do? We don't know, right? That's where the real power of the opera comes. So the actual opera is set well after the war. I think it's set around the 1960s. So she's recalling all this, and she's got a tape recorder that she's trying to work to talk about her experiences. And so that's where the opera begins. And it's late at night. She can't sleep. She's attempted to record her experiences on a tape recorder, having been asked to do so by a professor. She painfully recalls how it was her job to receive the prisoners from their transports, sort them into groups, take their belongings, all the while knowing what horrific fate soon awaited them. Filled with guilt, she remembers having to use force and cruelty in order to keep herself alive and safe. She tells the story of how she risked her life to steal a dying friend who came just for a cup of warm water. It was forbidden for her to give that water, but she did. And later on, after the war, she takes her new husband and mother on a visit to Auschwitz and mentions how disgusted she is that Auschwitz is now just an entertainment site for tourists who just want to come and look and have no idea of the hell that it was. And she recounts the words how when she was there with her husband touring the old place, he says to her, Krishna, nothing is there, only grass. What happened exists only in your head now. And then as the opera ends, the light of morning begins to filter through her window. The sting of survivor guilt comes over her once again, and she simply numbly comments that she has just seen another sunrise before she turns off the recorder. And that's how the opera ends. Yeah. It's really, it's powerful stuff. Yeah. So we don't know. So she's got all that guilt from what she did, and she should have been right there in their place, but she's alive.
Well,
They aren't.
I'll ask you this question and then if you'll answer it for the next one as well, it'd be good.
Yeah.
So how does the music, how does the music reflect um
It, that the
the
music is, yeah, and I want to mention that Jake Heggie, he's like say a contemporary composer. His music is it's amazing. All right, just put it very mildly. He is able to evoke emotions on a very, very visceral level. Um, he uses the piano, for example, in a very interesting way. Like you'll hear the piano, he often uses the very lowest possible notes on the piano to give sort of a visceral sound of almost like a deep bell ringing or an ominous sound. There's one point in one of the operas where I have to actually reach my hand into the piano and tap with my fingers on the actual strings rather than playing on the keys. And it gives this horribly ominous, deep rumble of doom kind of a sound. And then beyond just those more visceral things, his melodies and his music just has as you'll see, an incredible level to communicate the emotion that the characters are feeling. He really is. I had never heard of him before before looking at these operas for this performance. I'd never heard him before. He's particularly well known as a songwriter, but he's a very prodigious composer. And I got to tell you, he's on the level of someone like a Samuel Barber, even if you've ever heard him, a 20th century American composer. His ability to communicate emotion through music it's really amazing. Yes, he sometimes, especially on for a look or a touch, he'll have some musical theater gestures that he does. You can tell he's well versed in musical theater. But every bar really of that music just communicates directly to the listener what the character is thinking and feeling at the time.
and that's what opera's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, and he is brilliant at doing it. His music is at first glance, some of it is kind of dissonant, but not too much so. And he always uses dissonance to an end, not just for the sake of it. But overall, it's very melodic and very accessible while being contemporary. He's a very original. He's really got the spark, as it were, as a composer.
And so this is a one-woman show, just
Correct.
a one woman, which is unusual, and carrying the thread from our beginning conversation when I was asking you about how opera originated. And,
Right.
as we think of opera, most novices do as
Right.
just being
Exactly.
like a big play. I
Yep.
remember I was in Dallas, Texas, and I won't tell you the year, but it's been a while. When I say who I saw, Leontine Price and Robert Merrill, you'll know exactly what years it was with you will. And when I watched, it was Aida, and I watched the camels walk across the stage. That was my first experience with opera. So I always thought, well, my gosh, this is what it's all about. And then
Well,
when I
yeah.
saw the other one, I realized, and now it's down to, and I did ask you this one, do because I always thought you never spoke, in opera, like talked.
That's actually a very salient question, and absolutely you can. And there's history of it. In fact, in Germany, any opera was spoken in dialogue, and it was traditionally called a Singspiel. And
Right.
In France, any opera with spoken dialogue was called opera comique, which doesn't have to be an actual comedy, but they called it an opera comique if it had spoken dialogue in it. So technically, Carmen is opera comique because
And,
it contains spoken dialogue.
and we know that's not a comedy, don't we, Tim?
Definitely not. So yeah, so that's like Mozart's The Magic Flute would be considered technically in the Singspiel realm
Gosh.
because it contains spoken dialogue. Mm-hmm. But no, there's a history of that going back centuries.
Okay, now let's talk about our second one that we'll
Yes.
see.
So this is the little more substantial of the two. It's a little bit longer. And this one you'll find more musical theater elements involved, particularly in the second movement when they go back to their early days in Berlin. He's got a whole movement in here that just sounds like complete Gershwin. I mean, it's just Gershwin like you can't believe. And so this is the story about Gad Beck and Manfred Lewin. These were two Jewish men who in early life fell in love with each other and then got sucked up into the whole Nazi regime. And I don't need to tell you that the Nazi regime was not extremely sympathetic to young Jewish gay men. Okay. So this opera was from 2007. It was premiered in 2007 in Seattle. And the opera opens with Gad, who is an elderly man now, and he's trying to fall asleep, like at his kitchen table. Well, it's at a table. I don't know if it's his kitchen table. He's trying to fall asleep, and he's roused by the ghost of his former lover, Manfred, who had died in the concentration camps in 1942. And again, this is decades later after the war, just like they're on. Both of these take the form of reminiscences on an earlier time in life when these people were involved in the war. So when the ghost of Manfred appears, Gad expresses to his apparition that seeing him is too hard and the memory of him is too difficult after all these years. So Gad survived the war and went on to live out his life, whereas Manfred, his young lover, died in the concentration camps. Now, the only object that Gad had to remember Manfred by was his book of poetry. So here we go. There's poetry involved in this one as well. Gad Beck, the real Gad Beck. Now, these are both true stories. Gad Beck just died in 2012, which was 5 years after this opera premiered. So he was still alive when this opera premiered. And you can go online and you can watch a video interview with him. Now, the one I saw was completely in German, so I couldn't understand it, but you can go online and you can see him. So he only died fairly recently. So going back to the opera, Manfred appears and recites some of his poetry for Gad. Gad is now old and cynical and rejects these poetic notions, finding them too painful. Manfred sings about falling stars and moments when hope seems lost. He expresses that all they had was each other and how the trains took away the stars. There's a beautiful, beautiful song in here that talks about one star at a time being extinguished. And it, of course, represents the people dying in the concentration camps. So Manfred recounts the story of his horrors that he experienced in the concentration camps. Things, but they would just horrible things. They throw gay men to the dogs. They would they tie their hands behind their back and hoist them up on a pole until their arms broke all their sockets and leave them hanging there for hours. And they would do this en masse and called it the singing forest. Just the sickest stuff you've ever heard. And so this is the stuff that Manfred experienced firsthand in the concentration camps. And so later on, Gad himself gets arrested and imprisoned. At one point, when Manfred gets arrested by the Nazis, Gad tries to break him out. He actually dresses in the uniform of a Hitler Youth and goes to the concentration camp and says, Manfred is working for us. He's working for the Hitler Youth. He's a saboteur. That's why you thought he was a gay man. He's not really, but this was all a mistake. Please let him out. And they let Manfred out. But Manfred turns to Gad and says, I don't want to leave because I'll be leaving my family. And if I leave my family, I'll never be free. And so he turns down his freedom, leaves Gad, goes back to the camp, and dies with his family. They talk about how homosexuals were forced to wear a pink triangle on their left arm to identify. And apparently the Nazis did this not just with gay men, but they did it with various other things. Apparently, if you were a Jehovah's Witness, they put a purple triangle on you. I didn't know they had a thing particularly against Jehovah's Witnesses, but apparently they did. And various other colors for various other categories of undesirables. They talk about paragraph 175, which gay men were forced to wear in large letters on their jackets. Now, this is an actual German law that wasn't repealed until 1994 that criminalized homosexuality. It went on the books in 1871 and it wasn't repealed until 1994. And the Nazis in particular really, really relished this because it fit right in with their ideology. So the story ends, basically they're back at the ghost of Manfred is there, and Gad asks them to, let's just dance together one more time. And they dance and just kind of dance off into the distance. And that's the end of the opera. Yeah, it's very, very poignant.
And the music in this opera, it seems to me there's a different tone throughout.
Well, yeah, it's equally communicative. It's a little less. The music in the Another Sunrise is extremely nostalgic, and it's very nostalgic, and you can just feel the regret just seeping through every single bar. This is the music in Look or a Touch is a little more diverse. It can be savage. Like there's a literal scene where a man's getting torn apart by dogs. And the music just brings that right out, just right in your face. It's really just frightening stuff. And all the other atrocities he communicates through music in various ways. There's, like I say, though, there's a second movement called the Golden Years. Now, this is the part of the opera where they flash back to when Gad and Manfred first met at this boisterous jazz club in Berlin. And there's fancy jazz music playing everywhere. That's where the Gershwin component comes in. And there's this, just stride piano playing. There's a band playing. Everyone's dancing, and just having a rollicking good time. And they're both very young men at this point. One I think is 19 and one is 21. And they're dancing and to the music, and all of a sudden the police show up, and everything stops with a big dissonant crash chord, and that's the end of it. All the fun and happiness and love and joy just stomped out like a candle immediately when the police show up, and then you're just back in dark reality. It's incredibly potent. You'll hear in that movement Jake Heggie doing his best Broadway, and that movement is just total jazz, Broadway, Gershwin, Guys and Dolls sort of a sound almost. but then you're thrust right back into the darkness. It's extremely
Talking
powerful.
talking about that, let's see. Let's see if we can pull some of that up. Okay.
Yeah, the one I sent you, the clip where you're at 8 minutes 40 seconds in, that's the Gershwini part.
Okay.
That's what I'd love to have you hear.
Let's keep our fingers crossed. You know how technology
Yeah,
is. Sometimes technology works and sometimes it doesn't. Okay. So but
yeah.
this
Here you go.
was I think this was the one, right, Tim?
Yep,
Hopefully.
right there, golden years. Watch this. They're recalling their early years together. Jazz club. That's the young Gad.
Wild, free, we are wild, we are free, taught you to be joyful, Berlin. You are free, you are wild, taught you to be child of Berlin. Golden years, golden years. Nice. I saw this. Give me a look or a touch and I'll know. A nod or a wink or a glance. We don't need words, just stand very close. Let's not miss out on a chance for love tonight. A look or a touch and I'll know you're the one. A grin or a smile. And for a while, tonight or a lifetime, we won't miss out on a chance for love right now. Dance with me. This is the Schwanenberg House Club in Berlin.
Okay,
Yeah,
we're gonna. We're not going to have the dancers, are we?
no. So that's a important point. There's various permutations of this opera. He wrote one for full chorus and everything, and that's a million times bigger production than what you're going to see here. All we're going to have here is just two people. One singing role, that's Manfred, and then one non-singing role that just speaks, and that's Gad. So it's just two people. So the Another Sunrise is one person, and Look or a Touch is just two people. Yeah. That was a much bigger production than anything we're going to see here, unfortunately. But yeah, it'll just be two people. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, we're kind of, wrapping it up a little bit, Tim, but tell us
Oh, I
what
wanted to share one thing. Can you see this?
I don't. Yes.
So these are the actual men in real life. This is Gad on your right and Manfred on your left. That's actual pictures of them when they were young. that this
Oh,
story is based on. Yep.
thank you for sharing that. So, my friends, if you're not excited about seeing this now, now that you've got the whole knowing before you go, Tim, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
I'll
Absolutely.
always make it just so special. And we're really looking forward to this. Is there anything coming up with Bow City or
Well,
opera? Anything
this is not in the immediate future. In next October, they're looking to do a Giancarlo Menotti opera called The Medium. They're probably going to do that over at Good Shepherd in that lounge because it's based on a medium that does seances and stuff. And it's a little darker work. It's about an hour long and it involves a murder at the end. But they got big plans. They're hoping in a couple of years to do Pagliacci. And they're hoping in maybe 3 or 4 years to do a full length opera at the Florida Theater if they grow enough by then.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So if you know any deep pockets that can that like music and like opera, send them their way because boy, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for benefactors, obviously.
Benefactors.
Yep.
Well, if it can happen in New York City, right, it can happen in Jacksonville. I we just was on my list to see an opera at the Met, and I got to see it last Christmas. It was Turandot. And oh my gosh, you talk about magnificent. That's what we need here, Tim. We need something that big there. I want to thank all of you for tuning in today to Know Before You Go. And I hope that you'll join us for, future Art at Noon presentations. The next Art at Noon is going to be in is February, and we are going to begin a discussion of stained glass. And that's going to be 3 parts. The first part will give you an overview of stained glass. The second part will talk about artists, really artists and people that have been involved in the production of stained glass. And then the third part is to take a journey through the cathedral and our rich history of stained glass. And we'll do some art walks over there and sharing that. And maybe, Tim, when we're over there, you could kind of give us some background music
All right.
when we do that art walk. That would be, what was that? What is that great pictures? What is a great composer piece? Pictures at the what?
Oh, pictures at an exhibition by Mussorgsky. Yeah.
We could have something like that, Tim. That would be great. But anyway, thank you so much, Tim, for joining us, and thank you, everybody. And hope you'll join us for Art at Noon. February the 18th, we have Spires in the Sun. We're going to be doing a great, that you're going to get news about that. We'll be touring 2 beautiful Carpenter Gothic churches, St. Mary's and Grace in Clay County. And the author of the Spires in the Sun book will be with us for that journey. So some of you that have some time, be looking for that and an explanation of that. Linda's here. There's great stuff going on. We've got a wonderful exhibit in Taliaferro Hall. We got a lot of stuff going on here. So share the news, will you please, and bring your friends and neighbors and loved ones to all this wonderful things that are happening at our cathedral. So tune in next time. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome very much.
Thank you.